Good morning, everybody. So we talked about the economic, demographic, and social sources of populism last time, and today we're going to zero in on the political sources that interact with them and produce the kind of politics that we have all been experiencing since 2016.
The leaders of the US, India, China, Australia, every single one of our allies, the Bank of England, the IFS, the IMF, the CBI, 5 former NATO Secretary Generals, the Chief Exec of the NHS, and most of the leaders of the trade unions in Britain all say that you, Boris, and Nigel are wrong. Why should the public trust you over them?
I'm not asking the public to trust me. I'm asking the public to trust themselves. I'm asking the British public to take back control of our destiny from those organisations which are distant, unaccountable, elitist, and don't have their own interests at heart.
Elitist.
Absolutely.
The Lord High Chancellor, conspiracy of elites. It sounds like something like Wolf Hall.
Well, I haven't seen Wolf Hall, but the one thing that I would say is that the people who are backing the Remain campaign are people who've done very well, thank you, out of the European Union, and the people increasingly, absolutely. The people who are arguing that we should get out are concerned to ensure that the working people of this country at last get a fair deal. I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms.
The people of this country have had enough of experts.
From organisations with acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong. Because these people are the same ones who've got consistently wrong.
This is proper Trump politics, isn't it?
No, it's actually a faith in the
Oxbridge Trump.
Well, it's a faith, Faisal, in the British people to make the right decision.
Blind faith?
I don't think it is, because one of the striking things about this debate is that those who are arguing that we should remain have a vested financial interest. The majority of people in this country are suffering as a result of our membership of the European Union.
What's your factual basis to say the majority of people in this country are suffering from EU membership?
Well, I know myself from my own background. I know that the European Union depresses employment and destroys jobs.
We haven't got a majority.
My father had a fishing business in Aberdeen destroyed by the European Union and the Common Fisheries Policy.
That's one person.
The European Union has hollowed out communities across this country. And it has also contributed to lower salaries for working people, and it has also ensured that young people in this country don't have the opportunities to get the entry-level job. You're on the side, Faisal, of the elites. I'm on the side of the people.
You said a majority. You, the Lord High Chancellor, said a majority of the British public was suffering from the EU. You have no factual evidence for that whatsoever.
Let me give you a fact.
No, you don't have any evidence for it.
Yes, I do.
Well, let's move on.
Because every year we give billions of pounds to the European Union, billions of pounds that we should be spending here.
Well, let's have a fact. There's been a fact on the side of your bus in 1-metre-tall letters, and let me quote, we send £350 million to Brussels every week. Let's fund the NHS instead. Which week was it that we sent £350 million to Brussels? Was it this week? Last week? Was it Christmas week? Easter week? Which week?
Every week we send actually more than £350 million to Brussels.
We send it. So hang on, so it comes out of a bank account in Britain and goes to Brussels. Does it literally leave the country? Doesn't leave the country.
And then we get some of it back.
Doesn't leave the country.
And we do get some of it back.
You know it doesn't leave the country. And you don't listen to me. UK stats authorities say the figure's misleading. The Treasury Select Committee, containing Brexiteers, says it's deeply problematic. One of your own backbench colleagues, a Conservative MP who's campaigning to leave as a respected doctor, refuses to hand out leaflets because he says you're treating the public as fools.
So that was a video that went viral because of Michael Gove's declaration that the British people are tired of experts. It was shortly before the referendum that was held later that month. I chose to start with that because, like the Tea Party videos I started with on Tuesday, it contains all the 4 elements of, in this case, British populism, but astonishingly similar, you might realize on a little reflection, to the 4 elements of American populism that we were talking about last time, namely the anti-elitism, the conspiracy theories, the hostility to taxes and government, and though not racist, this hostility to foreigners, this sort of xenophobic declaration that foreigners are hollowing out the labor market, taking jobs, destroying the British economy. And so I start with this just to make the point that while we spent all of our focus on the US last Tuesday, we're talking about a much more general phenomenon, and that's what's going to concern us today. We'll have much less to say about the US, although the 3 remaining lectures are going to be very centrally focused on the US. Today's agenda is to answer this question: what is it about democratic political systems that has fostered the resurgence of populist politics? And our answer is going to differ from much of what you read in that I'm going to shift the focus away from exclusive attention to voters and voting behavior, and instead also include attention to the incentives and motivations of politicians. If you wanted a bumper sticker for this lecture, I talked about the Tea Party narrative that Arlie Hochschild so cleverly portrayed with the cutting-in comments that she made in that clip. I said that had become weaponized, unlike many of the other narratives around the questions of race in American politics that I gave you some flavor of. But anytime a social scientist starts talking in the passive voice, you should get nervous. Become weaponized. How did it become weaponized? Just as people constantly talk about our politics has become polarized. But again, weaponization and populism and polarized politics don't fall out of the sky. And we need to think about who it is that is mobilizing people to vote in a particular way. It's not as if 63 million Americans were sitting around saying, if only somebody would come along and propose building a wall. That's not how mobilization works in politics. Politicians see opportunities to mobilize voters in certain ways rather than others, and then use them. So this lecture is going to be very much more focused on the incentives confronting politicians, how those incentives have changed, and how that has shaped the politics that we're experiencing. I'm going to be very centrally focused on the political system today, but we shouldn't lose sight of the broader context that we've talked about several times in the course, the impact of globalization, technology, and slow growth on middle-class incomes and working-class incomes, the aging populations in all of the developed countries that put more and more pressure on fiscal states as the working age population that's supporting retired populations is getting relatively smaller and smaller, and the collapse of the corporatist consensus between business and labor that underpinned the social democratic welfare states in the early post-war period, largely as a result of the collapse of organized labor. These are all themes from earlier in the course that we should have in the back of our minds. What I want to say about them today is that all of those things make it much harder to govern, and it leads voters often to demand political reforms and to the rise of anti-system parties or anti-system groups within political parties. And that, in turn, creates the risk of what I'm going to call the political equivalent of bloodletting, namely fixing things that were not broken in ways that actually make the situation worse. And we will see particularly how this has played out in the United Kingdom since the 1970s. The pressure to reform the British political system ramped up in the 1970s. A very important book by Anthony King, unfortunately now deceased, called The British Constitution, points out that apart from the war decades, the 1970s were one of the most difficult decades in British economics. It was the three-day week, it was the oil shock, Britain was actually forced even to go to the IMF and be bailed out. And that caused a lot of people to demand political reforms, even though actually the problems that Britain was experiencing had nothing to do with the political system, but they reformed the system in ways that have hamstrung its ability to confront many of Britain's problems. So the central questions I'm going to zero in on this lecture are: how do the number and nature of political parties affect politics? And there I'm going to be interested in, when I talk about number, two-party systems versus multi-party systems. And when I talk about the nature of political parties, I'm going to be talking about weak parties versus strong parties. And I'll say more about what I mean by weak and strong as we move along. And then the second question is, I'm going to look at what are the implications of this for the economy and society. How does it affect? How do these phenomena, the number of parties and the strength of parties, affect labor markets, corruption, the propensity for corruption and growth, and also how do they affect the likelihood that we're going to see populist politics? So that's our agenda. So just for people who like tables, here's a 2x2. If we think of two-party systems, the classic strong two-party system would be the UK system before they started messing it up in the 1970s and subsequently. So I'll have a lot to say about that. And then weak two-party systems would be the US system. We have very weak political parties in ways that I will elaborate on. Western Europe has traditionally had strong multi-party systems, and although they've also been weakened in recent years. And in much of Eastern Europe, in France and much of Latin America, we have multiple parties that are also weak parties. Israel also fits into that box. To some extent, we'll see these are, if you like, ideal types, and many actual political systems are hybrids. But nonetheless, the center of gravity is what I'll be talking about when I think about these different possibilities. Now, I'm talking about political parties. Well, what is a political party? How do we know one when we trip over it? So here's one famous classical definition that Burke came up with in the 18th century. He said, a political party is a body of men, as they then were, united for promoting by their joint endeavors the national interest upon some particular principle in which they're all agreed. Kind of a verbose mouthful. More simply put, you can say that parties promote what I'm going to call partisan conceptions of the public interest. They're partisan in that they come from a point of view, but they are declared to be conceptions of the public interest, not of a private interest or a sectional interest. So if you remember when Mitt Romney got caught on a microphone, I guess in what he thought was a private meeting, saying that he represented only he could only aspire to represent 53% because 47% were the takers and we're the makers. It was a politically disastrous thing for him because you can't say that. Politicians are going to say, the American people want, the American people need. I'm going to represent all of the American people. So this is the idea of a conception of the public interest, even though it comes from a partisan point of view. And I'll unpack what I mean by partisan. More of that later. But let's start by two-party systems versus multi-party systems. Now, what is it that determines whether you get two parties or lots of parties? It's the electoral system, and there's something that political scientists call Duverger's law. And so Duverger's law, this is a rather impenetrable mumbo-jumbo. It's this single-member plurality systems, SMP, That's like we have and like they have in the UK, systems in which all you need is the most votes in a district to win the seat. They will tend to produce two parties, and indeed his formula is, he says, is district magnitude plus 1. So district magnitude means the number of people getting elected from a district. So district magnitude in the US or the UK is 1, and plus 1 you're going to get a two-party system. All else equal, but need to unpack all else equal. That assumes that most districts are going to be like most other districts, or if you like to put it in more technical terms, that the median voter in a district is pretty much going to be the median voter in the country. So every district looks more or less like every other district in its political composition. If that's not true, as in India, where there's big regional variation, then you'll get more parties. So even though in India they have single-member district systems, they nonetheless have more parties. Or in the UK, for instance, you have regional variation, so you can get the Scottish nationalists in Scotland. But for the most part, if you have big, diverse districts that are more or less like one another, you're going to get two parties out of single-member plurality systems. Whereas if you have proportional representation, and this is if, in the limiting case, in pure PR, as say in Israel, if you get 60% of the vote, you get 60% of the seats. Your party gets 30% of the vote, it gets 30% of the seats. Then you will get lots of parties. Other things being equal. Again, so for instance, you can reduce the number of parties in a PR system by putting in a threshold. So in Germany, there's a 5% threshold. Parties that fall below 5% don't get any seats in the parliament. So that's one way in which you can make a multi-party system function more like a two-party system. Another way in which you can make a two-party system function more like a multi-party system is by having multiple rounds. So in France, they have a first round and a second round. So even though they have single-member district system at the moment, the French change their system so often that it's hard to keep track of it. But at the moment, they have single-member district system. They're beaten only by the Italians for changing their electoral system every 5 minutes. But so in France, currently, they have single-member districts, but because they have two rounds, the small parties stay in the first round in order to then essentially extract rents or benefits for supporting bigger parties in the latter rounds. So the two rounds keeps the small parties alive. So there's these sort of variations around the edges, but basically the big point is if you have PR, you're going to get proliferation of parties, and if you have single-member district systems like we have, like the British have, like they have in Canada, although again, regional variation produces the different outcome with the Quebecois, but basically single-member districts are going to produce two-party systems. Okay. Now, there's one big debate about, well, which is better, which is fairer, which is more representative. And people often say, well, multi-party systems are much more representative in the sense that, if you think about a multi-party system, the Greens get their party in Parliament, and the Social Democrats get their party in Parliament, the Libertarians get their party in Parliament, the anti-immigrant people get their party in Parliament. Everybody gets a seat at the table, and so it's more representative. And in that sense, multi-party systems are often defended as fairer because they are more representative. And the British Liberal Party endlessly complains that they get very few seats, and if Britain had PR, they would do much better, and they've tried to, at least they only took this view once they lost power at the beginning of the 20th century. Before that, they were strongly opposed to PR, but now they see that it would benefit them. One important caution, though, is we shouldn't conflate the electoral stage with the government formation stage in a political system. So if you think about, we think about the 2015 elections in Greece, that was the outcome of the election. All the different parties were represented, but that was the government that formed. It was a far left party and a far right party. So the people who voted for all these other parties were unrepresented in the government, right? And so you could say it's more representative at the electoral stage, but not more represented at the government formation stage. 3 years later, the Italian elections produced a comparable result. Again, you got a far left party and a far right party. And as I mentioned to you in our very first lecture in Germany in 2017, they had a grand coalition between the SPD and the CDU prior to that. The election result was such that the Social Democrats said we're sick of being in this coalition, which we get damaged by because of all the concessions we have to make to be in the government. And so they didn't want to join, and Merkel spent 6 months trying to put together a coalition between the Free Democrats, who were sort of like libertarians, sort of Rand Paul type libertarians, and the Greens, who are for environmental regulation. Not surprisingly, she failed because they want no regulation and they want green regulation, so there's not much of an intersecting set. And during those 6 months, all the polling showed that the Alternative for Deutschland was going to do even better if they went to another election. So finally, they put back together the Grand Coalition. We've got to think about, when we're thinking about this is really something of a trade-off between increasing accountability and representativeness at the electoral stage, which might come at the expense of accountability of actual governments. And that I'm going to dig into a little more deeply. Now, one of the objections that people make to two-party systems is the Tweedledee, Tweedledum problem. And the Tweedledee, Tweedledum problem, or as I put it here, the Tweedledum, Tweedledee problem, which is the mirror image of the Tweedledee, Tweedledum problem, is basically that politicians in a two-party system are chasing the median voter. So if you think about it this way, if the right of center party went over here, where I've got that B on the slide, the center to the left, the party to the left would move toward it to pick up a lot of votes, right? So if you think about, 1964 in the U.S., Barry Goldwater has a very conservative platform. And the result is Lyndon Johnson wins a massive victory. So you can't do that if you want to win. The parties are going to head for the middle. But then, if they do that, both parties are going to be offering the same policies, right? That just follows almost definitionally. They might get it wrong, right? So Goldwater maybe thought he was close to the median voter, and when Ronald Reagan ran in 1980 on more or less the same program, everybody said, what an idiot. We saw what happened to Barry Goldwater, but whether it was Reagan's brilliant strategy or blind staggering luck or some mix, the median voter had moved, and so Reagan could prevail. But generally speaking, all of the incentives for politicians, which is what I'm focusing on here, are to head for the middle in a two-party system. And so then people say, but voters are not going to get a choice. If two parties are basically, especially if they have very sophisticated polling and they learn about where the median voter is, it's much better now than it was in 1964. It's going to be a problem from the point of view of giving voters choice. So that is true up to a point. So if you think about Britain, National Health Service, put in by Clement Attlee in the post-war Labour government, 1946, comes into operation over the next couple of years. Hugely popular in British politics. It's bulletproof. If you look at polling on the most popular institutions in Britain, it's more popular than the second most popular institution, which is the Queen. And this means that the National Health Service really is bulletproof. People want to keep it. And so even in Margaret Thatcher's rolling back the welfare state in the 1980s, she couldn't dismantle the National Health Service. Of course, there'll be squabbling at the margins about funding and coverage and this sort of thing, but basically it's there to stay because the median voter has an intense attachment to it. Not everything's like that. So if you think about nationalizing and denationalizing British Rail, you know, that has occurred 3 times, and if Jeremy Corbyn comes into office, they might renationalize British Rail. Similarly, in the US, think about Social Security brought in by FDR. I talked about this last time in 1935, and Medicare, insurance for people over 65, brought in by Lyndon Johnson as part of the Great Society in 1965. These are also bulletproof, hugely popular with the median voter, basically bulletproof. But again, not everything is like that. So if you think about how to respond in a recession, your left of center parties are going to generally push for deficit spending. They have Keynesian outlooks and think that the problem is insufficient demand, and there's got to be a demand-led return to revive the economy. Whereas supply side is on the right are going to say, no, what we need in recessions are tax cuts. And so you're going to get very divergent responses to recessions. Or if you think about protections for labor, the Wagner Act I mentioned before, put in place by FDR in 1935, was the strongest protections for unions in American history. By 1947, when the Republicans were back in control of Congress, they repealed the guts of it over Harry Truman's veto. That means, you know, they had 2/3 in both houses to do that, greatly weakening the Wagner Act. Or more recently, if you think about the Dodd-Frank law, which we've discussed a little bit, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau put in as part of that law has since been savaged and weakened and might be completely dismantled by the Trump administration and the Republicans in Congress. So that's what I mean by a partisan conception of the public interest, to go back to the beginning of the lecture. So this is one partisan conception of the public interest, and this is another partisan conception of the public interest. There will be some overlap, so some Tweedledees, Tweedledum, but there'll be a lot of areas where, in fact, there's divergence, partly for ideological reasons, partly because people don't actually know what the best way is to respond to a recession, and partly perhaps for other reasons as well. And so while the Tweedledee, Tweedledum is an issue to some extent, we should notice that for the most part, you do get significant divergence. Now, some people say, well, the electoral system doesn't really matter that much. All the stuff I'm going on about, there's less to this than meets the eye. Because if you think about a two-party system, it's a bit big tent parties. They've got lots of different interests in. Basically, they've put together a coalition before the election. Multi-party systems put together the coalition after the election. What's the big difference? You know, they're more or less going to turn out to be the same. So we shouldn't really get this hot under the collar about the differences. I think that is fundamentally misguided. And there are 5 reasons, and I'm going to work my way through them, why, particularly when we focus on the incentives created for politicians, The differences matter, and they matter in ways that are relevant to our larger concern. And the differences all come down to the fact that in two-party systems, it's winner take all and loser lose all. And that creates a fundamentally different dynamic for politicians. I'm going to start by, again, this is mumbo-jumbo, but I will unpack it into common sense terminology in a minute. It's that in two-party systems, politicians have an incentive to internalize the costs of the deals that they make. And so let me explain what I mean by this. Let's suppose I, in a two-party system, am in charge of strategy for the party that's to the left of center in the diagram I just did. And who's a right-winger? Steve Weisner over there is a right-winger. He's in charge of strategy for the right-of-center party, okay? So Steve and I both know that if I lose, he wins. If he loses, I win. That's right, and everything, can get control of everything. And so it's very important to both of us not to leave any voters on the table that we might be able to get, because that one last voter you leave on the table might be the difference between winning everything and losing everything, okay? So now think about in a multi-party system. After an election, maybe the big, like Germany, Grand Coalition, which often happens, the big Labor Party and the big Business Party are forming a coalition. What does business want? Business wants industrial peace, predictability, no strikes. What does labor want? They want, protection of workers' wages, protection of their members. So they might make an agreement that gives both parties those things while externalizing the costs of that agreement onto others, like higher prices for consumers, right? Or if you think about an agrarian party thinking of joining a coalition, what does the agrarian party want? It wants protectionism, it wants price supports for agriculture, right? And they make that the condition of joining a coalition, right? But that might produce higher food prices for the rest of the population. But the election's already over, nobody's worried about that, so they'll externalize the costs of the deals that they're making. When Steve and I are confronting one another before an election, we have to worry that if we are seen as responsible for inflation, then, or advocating policies that are going to produce inflation, then the other party is going to win. So we both have incentives to make the deals we have to make to put together our party without externalizing costs any more than we have to. We have to worry about what Americans like to call swing voters. That we will satisfy our core constituencies in ways that impose as few costs as possible on swing voters. That's the basic incentive. So that's an important distinction. Then secondly, when we do that, we're going to have to worry about what I put it here, and I mentioned this earlier when we talked about referendums during the lecture on the anti-tax movement, but I'll just come back to the analytical core of the point there, is that when we put together a platform, we have to bundle a lot of policies together, right? Policies on abortion, policies on education, policies on spending. We have to bundle all of these things because voters are getting a choice. It's essentially, you're forcing it down to one dimension, and you've got to push everything together, and when you do that, you have to discount everything you propose by everything else you propose. The example I gave you earlier, just to remind you, is if you ask Americans, would you like to get rid of the estate tax, which almost nobody pays, you can get 70% to say yes. But if you say, would you like to get rid of the estate tax if that also meant getting rid of prescription drug benefits for seniors, then you get majorities saying no. So in the second case, they're bundling their preference or discounting their preference for tax cut by their preference for keeping prescription drug benefits for seniors. So that's what parties do. They bundle together lots of issues, but they've got to do the discounting. Steve and I both have to worry about doing the discounting of all these issues against each other in ways that will alienate as few voters as possible because of the winner-take-all character of it. In a multi-party system, it doesn't work like that. If you're representative of the Green Party, you're just going to say, I'm going to go hell for leather for green legislation if I get elected, if our party gets elected, right? You're essentially only appealing to your core voters. And the more fragmented the system gets, the more parties you get, the more they're going to be like that. In fact, all your voters are sort of going to be like primary voters in the US. I have more to say about primary voters later. And often you'll have parties that only have a single raison d'etre, like the Green Party has a single raison d'etre. Anti-immigrant parties have a single raison d'etre. The religious parties in Israel have a single raison d'etre. So they're just going to try to, if you like, turn out their base because they know they're not really going to appeal to many other constituencies. And so they are not going to do this kind of bundling and discounting of the things that are important to them with the things that are important to others borne in mind. And you can see this by taking a third analytical comparison that I put up here of two types of arbitration in industrial disputes. So if you have industrial disputes, you know, management and labor can't agree on a contract, sometimes there'll be a provision, okay, we'll go to arbitration. We'll let a third party decide. And when you do that, typically what happens is management takes their position, the unions take their position, the arbitrator comes in, does fact-finding, and picks a solution, usually some form of compromise. Of course, everybody knows that's going to happen, and so because they know that that's going to happen, they behave strategically. So the management might take a much more extreme position than it really believes in, as will the union. Just, you know, like a store putting up their prices later to put them down and say they're having a sale, so that when the compromise is made, they hope it'll get somewhere closer to what they really want. There's a different kind of arbitration called last best offer arbitration. And last best offer arbitration works like this. Management takes their position, the union takes their position, the arbitrator has to pick one. There's no fact-finding, no compromise. Okay? The arbitrator has to pick one. And you won't have to think about this for very long to realize that in last best offer arbitration, people tend not to behave strategically and tend not to take extreme positions because of the fear that if you do that, the arbitrator will pick the other side. So people tend to be reasonable, they tend to converge, they head toward their sincere preferences, if you like, and they head toward the middle. Well, two-party competition is much more like last best offer arbitration because the voter is essentially put in the position of being that last best offer arbitrator, right? So Steve has to put together a platform, and I have to put together a platform which we think that last best offer, that median voter in the position of political analog of the last best offer arbitrator will choose. Whereas if you think about multi-party systems, again, the big incentive is to create a surplus to give away during the negotiations, right? So you can say, well, I've made all these compromises. And so you're going to get a lot more strategic behavior, and you're going to have parties making very different kinds of deals based upon the positions that they take. And so if you want parties to put together programs that appeal to a lot of, as many voters as possible, what we sometimes call programmatic policies. You want policies that are going to serve the interests of the largest number of voters. You're more likely to get that out of a two-party system than out of a multi-party system where coalitions are going to be put together in the short run to protect the members of the coalition for that government, but nobody, as we'll see, is thinking much about the future. Another difference that's important to notice has to do with opposition. If Steve gets it right and I get it wrong, I go into opposition. And then I will spend my time attacking his government and telling voters, vote them out, put us in, and you know what you'll get. And we put together the alternative program. In a multi-party system, you have no idea what will happen if you kick out the government, because you don't know ex ante what coalition is going to be formed next time around, right? Just think back to the Germany example I started with. Had Merkel managed to put together the coalition with the Greens and the Free Democrats, then the SPD you'd have a centrist opposition. Now that you've got now that you've got a grand coalition, you've got splintered opposition of very disparate parties lobbing their different grenades at the government, but nobody knows what will happen after the next election and what sort of government might be formed. So voters have no idea what the alternative to the current government actually is. And so again, it's a feature of multi-party government. Or to put it another way, in a two-party system, parties are sort of like marriages. Of course, sometimes people get divorced, but people don't marry intending to get divorced. They intend to stay together and to be seen as a family and to have certain characteristics and to plan to exist for the long run. Parties are just the same. Occasionally they fall apart. The Whigs fell apart in the 1850s in the US. The Liberal Party collapsed in the first decade of the 20th century in the UK. But for the most part, parties expect to be together over the long run, to think, therefore, about policies for the long run, and so on. Multi-party governments are more like hookups, right? This is cool for me right now, but who knows? All bets are off about the future. The future will take care of itself. And so, again, if you want governments that are going to invest in policies for the long run, it's more likely that you're going to get such governments when you have two-party systems rather than multi-party systems. So for all of these reasons, it's mistaken to think that there's nothing at stake here. And if you want to think about what will make it more likely that politicians will develop policies for the longer run, you're more likely to get that out of two-party systems than out of multi-party systems. And the more fragmented that the multi-party systems become, the more difficult or the more pronounced these disadvantages are going to be. So let's talk a little bit about strong versus weak parties. So this is the second dimension of the 2x2 with which I began. Now, an important feature of political parties that often goes unnoticed, but and I haven't mentioned yet, but I want to bring it to your attention, is that they're very unusual institutional creatures in that nobody owns them. The closest thing there is actually a private university in the US. Okay, so think about Yale. Who owns Yale? The truth is nobody owns Yale. If you sold off all of Yale's assets, as with a firm, if you sell off all the assets, there's a residual claimant. It's a shareholder. So if you sold off all the assets, pay the debts, you'd give the residual claimant is the shareholders. There is no residual claimant at Yale. So if you sold off all of Yale's assets and paid off all of its debts, it's not clear who would be entitled to the residual. And that has the implication that governance is always controversial. The faculty think they should govern Yale. The students think they should govern Yale. The alumni think they should govern Yale. The corporation think they should govern Yale. The donors think they should govern Yale. Nobody agrees on who should actually be governing, right? Because it's an unowned entity. There's no analog to the shareholders. Political parties have this same feature. There is no equivalent of a shareholder or a residual claimant in a political party. And so for that reason, the governance of political parties is endemically controversial. There's always going to be fighting over who should govern political parties. And a lot of what we've seen in our current politics is because the fighting over who should govern political parties has tended to come out a certain way. And so that's what I want to zero in on now. So definitions are important. What is a strong party? Well, here's one definition from an article in World Politics last year. A unified, centralized, stable, organizationally complex, and tied to long-standing constituencies. As I said, political scientists never say in words of one syllable what can be said in words of 5 syllables. I like simple things, so I would say a strong party is a party in which everybody's on the same team. Everybody is trying to achieve the same goal. Everybody's pulling in the same direction. That's what I would think of as a strong party. And one feature of that would be backbenchers choose frontbenchers, backbenchers being what we call members in the US, choose frontbenchers, the people running the parties, who choose backbenchers, who choose frontbenchers. And so let me explain why that's important. First of all, backbenchers will give frontbenchers a lot of leeway, what I call, to discipline them. It's a so-called, I call it Ulysses and the Sirens discipline, in the sense that, the famous story of Ulysses and the Sirens is that Ulysses is tempted to do things that won't be good for him. So he wants to be disciplined, right? So the intuition here is that, going back to remembering Steve and I were facing winner take all, loser lose all. If our backbenchers, if we're the leaders of the party, they know we both have incentives to design a platform and pick candidates for running in the different constituencies that can both win in their districts and support a national winning platform, right? Whereas if you just focus on the individual backbenchers or the individual members, they're just trying to survive in their district. So they might want a very big margins. If there are idiosyncratic preferences in their district that might be unpopular nationally, they're going to focus on those things. So the idea is backbenchers will give a lot of leeway to frontbenchers to discipline them, to determine what the platform's going to be, to have a big role in candidate selection, but they only have enough rope to hang themselves. If, one indicator is that we have very weak political parties, is that Nancy Pelosi led the Congressional Democrats to 4 successive defeats and still stayed there, right? Just as with a sports team, the quarterback or the coach has a lot of authority, but it's conditioned on delivering victories. If they don't deliver victories, they're going to be gone very quickly, right? So this is the idea. The backbenchers have a big interest in delegating authority to the frontbenchers, conditional on their delivering victories. And if they don't, they won't survive for very long, because the reason for delegating the authority will have gone away. Weak parties are parties in which everyone's in it for herself or himself. Lots of people worried about their own survival in their own district. Lots of retail campaigning, not wholesale campaigning. This comes back, by the way, to our discussion of money in politics. Weak parties, politicians in weak parties need much more money because they're all campaigning for their own survival. You'll see a lot of deal cutting. It'll make an American system look more like a European system. And, you know, I'll support the unnecessary military base in my district if you'll support in your district, if you'll support the unnecessary military base in my district, what political scientists call pork barrel spending. You will not see individual members worried about the national program. Candidates and platforms will tend to be controlled from below or from outside by the people who are funding the candidates. And so you'll see a situation where leaders in the legislature find it very difficult to set the agenda and to whip the backbenchers to support their agenda. Again, another symptom of the fact that we have very weak parties in the US is that when the Republicans were in opposition, they voted 71 times, I believe, to repeal Obamacare, but when they came into office, they couldn't do it. The leadership couldn't whip the backbenchers to support the program of repeal because they knew they would pay too high of a price for it in their own constituencies. Now, the recent trend across the democratic world has been to weaken parties. And this has taken a number of forms in a number of systems, but it's all tended to produce the same result. So one way in which this has happened is in moving away from backbenchers selecting frontbenchers, members of a parliamentary party picking its leadership, to instead having leaders elected at large. So here's a pretty dramatic instance.
Jeremy Corbyn elected as leader of the Labour Party.
The veteran left-winger has comfortably reinforced his position as head of Britain's main opposition party. Corbyn was backed by nearly 62% of 500,000 party members who voted in the leadership contest after he'd been challenged by many Labour MPs. He immediately called for unity.
We have much more in common than that which divides us. As far as I'm concerned, let's wipe that slate clean from today and get on with the work we've got to do as a party together.
The immediate question is whether more centrist Labour MPs who'd opposed Corbyn will rally behind him. Beyond that lies the task of mounting a serious challenge for power. Critics say the infighting has left a vacuum in opposition that's been filled by the Eurosceptic hard right.
So Corbyn's call for unity there is a little bit alike, we might call it the British equivalent of whistling Dixie in that. But here's the interesting set of facts that led up to that. It used to be the case that, as I said, the parliamentary Labour parties elected their own leader. Starting in the early 1980s, they put in a series of reforms to weaken the role of the parliamentary party and strengthen the role of of larger constituencies out there, of unions and others. But in any event, when Ed Miliband was leader, they put in the system that any member of the Labour Party could vote in the leadership election. It cost £3 to join the Labour Party. And it has, as you saw, 450,000 members. So in 2015, after Miliband was forced to step down because they lost the election, as I said, in systems like this, if you don't deliver victory, you're gone. Corbyn won. And Corbyn was a card-carrying Marxist way to the left, never mind of the median voter in the Labour Party, but of the median British voter. And the parliamentary Labour Party quickly discovered they couldn't work with him. And so there were mass defections from the shadow cabinet, and eventually a vote of no confidence in him of 172 to 40. It's a pretty big majority. And then 3 months later, as you just saw, he was re-elected by 62% of the membership. So if you now think about Corbyn coming into government, which might happen in December of this year, you'll have a situation where he will not be able to govern with the members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, many of whom couldn't survive in their constituencies if they supported his program. So this is something that has gone on in country after country after country, with many, many political parties have moved toward more direct election of their leaders. And the difficulty is that the political activists who tend to join parties and participate are on the fringes of the parties and tend not to be representative of the people who turn out in a general election and elect people to Parliament. And so you get that problem. Secondly, increasing use. I talked a little bit about this when we did the anti-tax class. Increasing use of ballot initiatives, referenda, and plebiscites. Again, since we're talking about England, let's stay there.
Their verdict has been given by a vote and by a majority bigger than that achieved by any government in any general election in the history of our democracy. No one in Britain, in Europe, or the wider world should have any doubt about its meaning. It was a free vote, without constraint, following a free, democratic campaign conducted constructively and without rancor. It means that 14 years of national argument are over. It means that all those who have had reservations about Britain's commitment should now join wholeheartedly, without stint, in the task of overcoming the economic problems that assail us as a nation, and work wholeheartedly with our partners in Europe and our friends everywhere to meet the challenges confronting the whole world.
So this is what many people don't know when we think about Brexit referendum, that in fact the first British referendum ever was in 1975, called by Harold Wilson. At that time, the Labour Party was split over Europe and tended to be more anti-Europe because British workers had stronger protections than European workers, whereas the Tories tended to be more pro-European. So it's a flip, the mirror image of what it is today. And so Harold Wilson was confronting a very divided party, and rather than do the hard work of the discounting and so on to force a resolution within the party, he thought he had this great idea, let's just have a referendum. And so they had their first referendum, and as he said, two-thirds voted to stay in the EU. And I couldn't resist putting this on the slide. He crowed later he said, it was a matter of some satisfaction that an issue which had threatened several times over 13 years to tear the labor movement apart had been resolved fairly and finally. All that had divided us in that great controversy was put behind us. Of course, 5 years later, they split anyway when the left wing had gotten control after the first set of reforms to the leadership election process. The left wing had gotten control, and so-called Gang of Four, Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Shirley Williams, and Bill Rogers, left and formed a social democratic party which would eventually unite with the Liberal Democrats. Same thing with Cameron in 2016. He was trying to duck resolving the conflict within the Conservative Party, and so he thought he would do it with a referendum. It wasn't any more successful than Harold Wilson's effort. Interestingly, just to go back to Margaret Thatcher, in 1983, she was then a sitting prime minister. She had won in 1979. The 1983 election, she was pro-European in those days, but she said, Britain's getting a raw deal from the common market, and so we need to renegotiate. And particularly as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the agricultural policy and the fisheries policy that Gove was complaining about in that video worked to Britain's disadvantage. And so she negotiated a rebate for Britain came to about £40 billion a year. That would be an example of trying to figure out a way to redo the bundling, right? So yes, there's a Eurosceptic wing of the Tory party. They've got these complaints, so we'll do something to address them and redo the bundling and go on into the future. And it was pretty successful. Not only did she win in 1983, promising to do that, after she did it, she won the next election as well. So this was a very different approach than the use of ballot initiatives, referenda, and so on. Fixed Parliaments Act, again, we've seen this playing out in real time, weakens the power of the Prime Minister to whip the backbenchers to support a program. So in this case, if they had not put in the Fixed Parliaments Act, which was put in 2015, again to limit the unilateral power of the leadership, you now have to get a 2/3 vote in Parliament to call an election. But for that, Theresa May could have forced the Tories to support her deal that she had negotiated. No longer has that power. Lots of calls to strengthen presidents, partly because legislatures have become so dysfunctional and it's so difficult to form governments that can govern. People say, oh, we need to give more authority to executives to punch through all of the bickering in Parliament. And so you get, especially in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and increasingly here, claims that it's important to concentrate executive power because you can't otherwise govern. And this is not just Trump, but a series, one president after another, relying increasingly on executive power. Growing reliance on primaries and caucuses. Primaries and caucuses are seen as ways of democratizing the control and governance of political parties. They've been around for over a century in the legislature, but become more and more important because we have more and more safe seats. And if you have more and more safe seats, the primary election becomes the only election that matters. At the presidential level, primaries didn't become important until the McGovern-Fraser reforms that I talked about last time. But here's the thing about primaries and caucuses is, you're thinking about the primary, the left party's got to go to the median voter, you might think of their party, and the right party of the median voter of their party. But that's not what tends to happen, because the people who turn out in primaries and caucuses tend to be on the fringes of the parties. And so they're not even these people, but these people. And so you tend to get, it's extremely low turnout in these primaries and caucuses. So you can get, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez elected in New York with an 11% turnout. Jim Jordan in Ohio, or Mark Meadows, again selected in primaries with 15 or 16% turnout. And these people are not representative of the voters in their district, and never mind representative of the voters in the country. And so what tends to happen is they control who gets selected, and then when the people go to Washington, either they do the kind of compromising that's needed to pass legislation, in which case they get accused of having sold out by the people who selected them, or they don't, in which case you get gridlock and alienation of other voters. And so either way, the remedy does not address the voter alienation that people so often complain about. So, and just if you want a very recent illustration of this, I saw the other day on Morning Joe, Mike Murphy, a Republican strategist, was reporting on interviews of Senate Republicans, and had concluded that if the vote on removal from office of Trump were a secret ballot, 30 Republican senators would support it. But they, they know that if they're known to have done it, they'll face brutal primary challenges and will most certainly not survive. So, so that's the story about weakening parties. Now, some people say, well, maybe the best solution is the middle, is some mix. We talk about Labradors being, a Labradoodle is a dog with a nice personality that doesn't shed, right? And so people have often said, the Germans got it all right. They have a mixed system, partly single-member districts, partly PR, and they've been very successful for much of the post-war period. So maybe what we really want is a system that gets the best of all worlds. And Germany was always held out as the Labradoodle. Strong parliamentarism, unlike Weimar, which gave a lot of power to the president. The president is very much answerable to the legislature. The single-member districts that they only have 299. They're very big and they're very diverse. They're 3 times the size of Britain's. And that tends to make it function more like a two-party system. You tend to get predictable governments. Lots of party discipline until relatively recently, in candidate and leadership selection. No longer true in the SPD. And then there are various external constraints, budget rules, constraints from the EU, anti-protectionism requirements, and so on, that hemmed in the deals that governments could make. But it was all underpinned by this post-war social democratic consensus that I have mentioned to you several times. And even in Germany now, the truth is, we saw it took Merkel 6 months to form a government after 2017. The decentralized control of the SPD, which meant the 500,000 almost members had to vote on every provision of the coalition deal, meant that the negotiations were very tortured. Merkel had to give up 6 ministries, including the finance ministry, and produced a government over which she has very little control. The Grand Coalition splinters the opposition, as we've seen, and it's been very bad for both the parties in the coalition in the regional elections last year. They both hemorrhaged support, and this has happened more recently again in the local elections. And so what's going on in Germany is replicating the pattern elsewhere. I just remind you of the slides I showed you. This is the number of parties has gone up steadily since the 1960s. Particularly the fragmentation of parties on the left has been dramatic, and it's paralleled the decline in unions. Less dramatic on the right, but still, if you look at the number of right-wing parties as compared with the 1970s, they are much higher, many more of them than there used to be. And so the upshot is that you get weakened parties who have diminished capacities to form governments and govern, which produces more alienation of voters that then feeds demands for further reform. And so think about the parallels with the 1930s, with which we began this course. So in the 1930s in Britain, there were also fascists. They were called the Mosleyites. And in 1936, the Mosleyites actually had larger membership than the Nazi Party in Germany. But they didn't get any seats in parliament because of the two-party system, right? And whereas in Germany, in Italy, in these other countries, you know, you got I showed you this picture in the very first lecture. You had a highly fragmented system, government impossible, and then the Nazi Party just sweeping through and eventually taking power. And people worry about whether this isn't where we are headed again. And if you think about the last decade or so, again, in Britain, we've had the rise of UKIP, we've had the British National Party, which is even further to the right than UKIP. But because they don't have PR, these parties don't get anywhere in the political system. Instead, as we've just seen now with Nigel Farage, he's basically having to have influence through the Tories if he really wants to affect the outcome if the Tories win. Otherwise, we'll be looking at a hung parliament, and it'll make it look more like a European system. And so he's essentially pulling Johnson to the right to take some of his concerns into account, but not being able unilaterally to determine the outcome. Whereas in all the European systems, these very anti-Europe parties, anti-system parties are doing much better. So again, we worry that this might not be some kind of portent for the future. So what are the implications more broadly for the economy and society? The takeaways of today is that in two-party systems, we should expect comparatively weak protections for organized labor, because unions are not a majority of the party, and comparatively low spending and redistribution. That, incidentally, is why people on the left used to prefer multi-party systems, because they were thought to be more redistributive. But in multi-party systems today, you should expect organized labor to be decreasingly effective at protecting a shrinking labor aristocracy. And that's what we have seen playing itself out in all of these European systems. We should expect the emergence of populist parties with anti-immigrant and protectionist agendas. And where parties are weak, we should expect primary challenges or presidential candidates running on anti-immigrant and protectionist agendas, and we should expect that where you have fewer, stronger parties, it'll be easier to resist this. When we think about what's called clientelism, this is when you, instead of pursue programmatic policies in the interests of the polity as a whole, rather you reward sectional interests. We should expect that you're most likely to get programmatic politics out of strong two-party systems when Steve and I are worrying about not leaving any voters on the table over the long run. You are going to get what I call wholesale clientelism, giving the farmers their high prices, or, giving whatever you need to give. Give the religious parties in Israel whatever you need to give them to form a government. That's wholesale clientelism when you have multi-party systems. Where you have weak parties, you should see a lot of retail clientelism, bridges to nowhere, special deals for firms in your district, because that's what people are worried about. And when you have lots of weak parties, we should expect lots of wholesale and lots of retail corruption. Clientelism, lots of corruption. If you look at the statistics on economic performance, again, this is that paper from last year that I mentioned to you, the data also supports the idea that you get better economic performance when parties are strong. You can peruse this slide and that paper, which I strongly recommend at your leisure. So reform agendas, they're hard because of the very widespread misdiagnosis. People feel out of control. They want more democratization of political parties, more control from below, more unbundling, more referendums, more direction of leadership, and they don't understand that that's making things worse. It's hard also because the beneficiaries tend to not want to change the system that is put them in place. So when Renzi tried to reverse some of this in a referendum in 2016 in Italian politics, he had his head handed to them. Because starry-eyed progressives tend to think that more direct democracy is going to help them, but in fact, their agenda soon gets hijacked. It's not. It should be remembered that primaries were brought to us by the progressives at the beginning of the last century. Hard because of the misguided faith in PR. People think it's more representative. And it's hard because the direction that reform needs to go in is really the opposite of what most people think. And what to do in that difficult situation will be the subject of my lecture on December 5th. See you next week, when we will talk about the building blocks of distributive politics.